In this video, we'll write our first R code. As we do, we're going to be working with two critically important components for working in R, objects and functions. Nearly everything you do in R will involve either objects, functions, or in most cases, a combination of both. For this reason, you need to have a good grasp on what each of these are and how they are used. So let's spend just a minute or so talking about these now before we jump into writing code. The idea with objects and functions is pretty simple. Think about objects as things, something you can assign a name to and then later use that name to retrieve it. If you've worked in Microsoft Excel in the past, each file or workbook contains one or more sheets. Each sheet consists of a two-dimensional data set, rows and columns, and it can be named using tabs near the bottom of the screen. Because each sheet has its own name, we could think of each of these as analogous to an individual object in R. Specifically, they would be most like a specific type of R object called a data frame, which has two dimensions, rows and columns. Data frames are just one of many different types of objects in R, and we'll encounter other kinds or classes of objects as we go forward. Important takeaway here, objects are things in R that you can assign a name to, and then use that name anytime during your R session to retrieve that object. In contrast to objects, which are things, functions, as you might expect, do things. They perform some type of operation, often on one or more objects. Functions in R can be recognized by their syntax, which consists of the name of the function, often it's something descriptive of what the function does, followed immediately by a set of parentheses. Specific instructions for the function, called arguments, are often provided inside the parentheses. Now, if you don't already have an RStudio session open, go ahead and open one up now. We're going to create our first R object. In the text editor, let's type num_obj1, short for numeric object 1. This is the name we're going to give to this first object. We follow that with the left arrow and dash. This combination of characters forms what is called the assignment operator. The assignment operator is really important, as it's what we use to create objects in R. For example, we're assigning the value of 3 to a new object named numeric object 1. One thing to note here, in general, R is very forgiving when it comes to spacing. In most cases, you can put spaces in your code or not, and the code will run with no problems. One exception to this is object names. These can't include spaces. You'll also want to limit your object names to letters, numbers, and the underscore. Avoid any other symbols. Once you have that line of code typed into your text editor, now you need to run it. There are a couple of ways to do that. You could copy-paste the line into the R window. However, the recommended method is to make sure your cursor is anywhere on the line of the code you want to run and type Control-Enter. This will do the copy-paste for you and run the code. When the code runs, we see the new object show up in the top right window. Assuming that happened, great. You've created your first R object. If you need more convincing, you can enter the name of the object, numeric object 1, at the R prompt and hit enter. This will return the value 3. Well, actually it returns a 1 surrounded by square brackets, followed by the number 3. As you continue to work in and get comfortable with R, you'll learn why that bracketed 1 is there, and will get used to just ignoring it in most cases. So, we can see that R created your object, but it turns out that R did something else too. As soon as it created it, R also assigned the object to what is called a class. Here are a few classes that you'll encounter frequently. Characters, numerics, which are also sometimes referred to as doubles, logicals or true-false, matrices and the similar data frames, lists, and factors. In reality, there are lots of different classes of R objects. As an example, let's briefly consider the data frames I mentioned a few moments ago when I compared them with an Excel spreadsheet, and how data frame objects relate to matrix objects in R. Data frames and matrices are two types of objects that have somewhat subtle, though important differences. Specifically, all the columns of a matrix have to store the same type of data, for example, all numeric or all character. In contrast, while data frames look like matrices in that they are two-dimensional objects with rows and columns, data frames relax the requirement of the type of data stored in them, and so can have, for example, a column of numeric data and a column of character data. Because they are generally more flexible in this regard, data frames typically get more use in R than matrices, though matrices still have their place. Fortunately, you don't need to know everything about every object class. As you work, you'll get comfortable with those that you encounter frequently, and the rest you'll learn about on an as-needed basis. Now, let's use a function to see what class our new object was assigned to. In your text editor, type the name of the function, in this case class, followed by parentheses. Inside the parentheses, we'll give it numeric_object1, which is the name of the object we want the class function to operate on. Again, with your cursor anywhere on that line, type Control-Enter to run the code. The function returns the class of our object. In this case, it's numeric. Because R sees this object as numeric, we can treat it like a number. For example, running the code numeric_object1 plus 5 gives us 8. Now let's run that again, but this time we'll assign the result of numeric_object1 plus 5 to a new object that we'll call numeric_object2. Next, we'll create a third object. We'll name this one char_obj1, short for character object1. And we'll assign 3 to this one too, but this time we'll put the 3 in double quotes. When we check the class for this object, we see that in this case, because we wrapped the 3 in the quotes, R has assigned it to the character class. As a result, it won't behave like a number. If we try to add 5 to it like we did before, we get an error. In R's mind, it's kind of like you're trying to add 5 to the letter A. It just doesn't make sense to do that. This serves as a simple example of a very important thing to understand about R. Being able to perform certain operations on a given R object will often depend on the class that object is assigned to. If a function you're trying to use expects the object to be of a certain class, and R has assigned that object to a different class, you'll likely see an error. It's important to try to pay attention to the classes of your objects. You can always use the class function to check this. Some good news is that if you have an object of one class and you need to convert it to another class, there are functions for that. The set of as.class functions convert or coerce objects to different classes. In our case, let's convert our character object to a numeric object with the as.numeric function. We'll assign the results of the function back to the name character object1, overwriting what was stored in that object before. Note that once we do this, that name isn't really accurate anymore, as the object is now of type numeric, not character. Since we made it numeric though, now we can add 5 again and get our expected result of 8. One more thing before we wrap up with this introduction to objects and functions. There are lots of functions in R. In fact, there are thousands and thousands of them. What's more, as R users keep writing new packages, even more functions are created. Again, like with object classes, there are some functions you'll use frequently, and you'll get to know these well. Others you'll work with and learn about on an as-needed basis. One great place to get information is from the help page for the function. Every function has one of these, and it can be accessed either by searching for the function name under the Help tab in the bottom right window, or simply by typing $, followed by the name of the function in your R window. These help pages follow a specific format and offer things like example usage for the function, arguments that can be passed to the function, default settings for the arguments, and the value or the result of the function. Get used to working with these help documents. You'll likely refer to them frequently as you work in R. In the next video, we'll work with an important type of data structure in R, vectors.